Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Miriam Hewitt. I'm Assistant Director at the Center for Public Service. Today's event, Beyond Social Justice, a conversation with Dr. Dylan Rodriguez, moderated by Dr. Samantha Francois, is co-sponsored by the Center for Engaged Learning and Teaching, the Center for Public Service, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking. A big shout out also to my colleague, Benji Brubaker, who initiated the idea of bringing Dr. Rodriguez to Tulane and supported the making of this event. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Francois with us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. Dr. Rodriguez is a teacher, scholar, and collaborator who's committed to building and supporting abolitionist, liberationist, anti-colonial, and other forms of radical community and movement. Since 2001, he has maintained a day job as a professor at the University of California, Riverside. He was elected to serve as president of the American Studies Association in 2020-2021, and in 2020 was named to the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars. Dr. Rodriguez is the author of 3 books, most recently, White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logic of Racial Genocide at Fordham University Press, which won the 2021 Frantz Fanon Book Award. Most importantly, he appreciates participating in all forms of collective study, thought, and planning that build capacities to survive and revolt against oppressive conditions. Dr. Samantha Francois is an assistant professor in Tulane University School of Social Work. She's also an executive director of Tulane University's Violence Prevention Institute and co-director of the Center for Youth Equity, a CDC Center of Excellence in Youth Violence Prevention. Her areas of expertise are in adolescent development, structural and neighborhood violence, and anti-racist research. As an interdisciplinary, community-engaged developmental scientist, Dr. Francois' research uses systems perspective and critical race theory to understand the intersections of individual, community, and structural factors that impact development in Black and African-American youth. She also explores youth-led activism and organizing as community and structural violence prevention strategies. Dr. Francois is a mixed methods researcher who uses community-based participatory and action research frameworks. She designs and executes research through an anti-racist and intersectional lens aimed at social transformation and community liberation. Now, without further ado, let me give you both the floor.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I am so excited to have this conversation and dialogue with Dr. Rodriguez, and I will call him Dylan throughout our dialogue, as we've already discussed. So let's jump right into it. I'm also I have questions that I'm going to kick us off with, but we are going to let this conversation and dialogue emerge organically. And we're really excited to have our many participants with us today contributing to this dialogue. So with that, Dylan, I wanted to start off with a direct quote from your essay, Reformism Isn't Liberation, It's Counterinsurgency. And in it you wrote, there is yet another layer of fatal assumption that structures the reformist position, that those targeted for misery, displacement, and premature death under the existing social order must tolerate continued suffering while waiting for the reformist fix to take hold. So what I wanted us to start with is asking you to talk about reformism, specifically reformism as magical thinking or counterinsurgency.
That was not a dramatic pause. I was taking notes to make sure that I get at your question as well as possible. Good morning, good afternoon, y'all. I'm Dylan Rodriguez, he, him pronouns. I'm talking to y'all from occupied Kauai, Tongva land, Southern California. I work at University of California, Riverside, which is down the street from where Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller in 1998. Really honored to be part of this series of conversations. I just say thank you to Samantha, to Miriam, to Benji, and to all of you all for taking time to be part of this dialogue and conversation. I'm really looking forward to sustaining something beyond this lovely spectacle of the two of us talking and hopefully some of y'all talking. So I'm hoping, as I shared with the organizers, I'm hoping that whatever we do here can both embolden and maybe even catalyze some vital cultural, political, artistic, and other forms of collective study and collective work. So that's my hope, anyways. And if I can play a role in that, some small role in that, I'd really be humbled and gratified to be part of that. In thinking about that point about what reformism is, I think, well, first of all, what a way to start a conversation, right? What a way to start a conversation. I deeply appreciate that we start a conversation from the premise that reformism is in fact a problem, that reformism is in fact not merely complicit in kind of condoning and passively reproducing structures of colonial, anti-Black, and other forms of gendered state violence, but that it is itself one of the enactments of those forms of what people have recently started calling systemic violence, right? And by systemic, I think sometimes people really kind of reduce what the system is. If we think about the system as a deep one that involves cultural apparatuses, epistemological and archival structures. I mean, I know a lot of folks here are lifelong students, educators, and researchers. I think we have to think about it this way. Think about spiritual systems, affective, psychological systems. And so if we think about systemic violence in the deepest way that we can think of, in the most dynamic way we can think of systems, it's only at that point that we can really begin to seriously, rigorously analyze why reformism is such a principal form of violence, oppressive violence right now. I don't want to pathologize violence. Not all violence is the same. You know what I mean? Like some violence and some destruction, I would argue, maybe we can talk about this, I would argue is necessary and creative. So I'm talking about oppressive and destructive and dominating and colonial and anti-Black violence here. That's what reformism is, and that's what it historically has constituted. I mean, that's the whole thesis of the book that that Miriam was referring to, that I just was able to get out last year. The key to that argument in that short piece that you were referring to, Samantha, is this notion that the reformist wager, and it's a deadly wager, the reformist wager is that the peoples who are targeted by state and state-condoned oppressive violence are somehow obligated to patiently absorb and to patiently continually absorb the violence while the kind of magic of an institutional fix manifests somehow, and that becomes the asymmetrical ethical and moral obligation that actually becomes the form of violence that targeted and oppressed people bear, right? And part of the kind of cultural and ideological violence of reformism is precisely the normalization of that ethical and moral asymmetry, right? That suffering people need to patiently suffer further, while investing this kind of magical pseudo-religious hope that the rescue, the Messiah-like rescue of reformism will gain traction and fix things, that your relief is coming if you get killed, right? If you suffer, if you starve, if if you're displaced, if you're insecure, you have to bear that because you're bearing it for the sake of just patiently don't disrupt anything, right? We don't need you destroying anything. We don't need you challenging the integrity of these existing apparatuses, regimes, institutions, and the state for that matter, because to do that would make things worse, right? That's the other, the generally unspoken but sometimes overtly stated premise of the deadly oppressive reformist wager is that if you challenge the integrity of reformism, that you're somehow endangering oppressed people and yourselves more, right? That it's somehow irresponsible and unethical. That's That's a kind of proto-religious line. Now, here's why it's bullshit, right? There's not only is there a kind of logical, philosophical, ideological rebuttal to that can be made. We can do that all day. I'm going to point to one thing, right? I'm going to point to one thing that I've been referring to repeatedly lately, because I think a lot of folks, for some reason, this hasn't become common sense to folks yet, and I think it needs to be. If we think about the global revolts against police violence, but also against the institution of policing that unfolded during the calendar year of 2020, intensified in the summer, right? Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and everybody else, right? But really, it was a revolt that had been sustained for at least half a decade prior to that, maybe more. You know what I mean? Like since I'm from the DC, Virginia area. I'm thinking about Freddie Gray, right? I'm thinking about what's going on in Baltimore. Think about Michael Brown. I mean, we can go all the way on down to Oscar Grant in Oakland. I mean, and this is just the prominent, Black male figures of police killing. You know what I mean? So we can go all the way on down the line and think about all the folks that have been targeted by police violence. But if we think about that particular moment in which there seemed to be a global acceleration of revolts against anti-Black police violence, gendered anti-Black police violence, but also against the institution of policing, against the legitimacy of policing, right? In many cases, against the existence of the police as a reified, normalized, embedded, not only state institution, but cultural apparatus. It was a global revolt against the cultural assumption that police are necessary to create security and safety for everybody. So that's the kind of humanist reformist wager, right? Is that there is an everybody, that there's such a thing as an everybody. There's such a thing as a universal, right? There's such a thing as an us. All right, so that gets challenged, and you got police stations being burned to the ground, right? Police cars being like lit on fire righteously. You have people who are no longer willing to tolerate the repression of the state, who are willing to fight back in various ways, right? And we can talk about the tactical, strategic issues around that if we want, right? But what I will not do is talk about whether it was moral and ethical or not. Like, I think self-defense in this case is, if anything, it's overdue, right? So you have all this unfolding in 2020, and then of course, predictably, what you had was a scramble among the whole kind of configuration of state institutions, kind of schooling, educational institutions, universities in particular, you know what I mean? Universities in particular, the police apparatus, police institutions themselves, administrators of all kinds, cultural workers of all kinds, the nonprofit industrial complex, meaning those involved with philanthropy, think tanks, foundations, and so forth. There's a mad scramble, something that Robert Allen talked about in his classic text, Black Awakening in Capitalist America, when he wrote about it in real time in 1969 through the early 70s. This analogous shit was happening back then, right? So you can almost follow this kind of formulaic response at that configuration of kind of bureaucrats, administrators, and state leaders, state officials, I should really say, were trying to figure, they're scrambling to try to figure out how to domesticate and pacify what was clearly out of their control in every way, right? It was out of control. Ideologically, it was out of control. Politically, it was out of their control. And then, of course, people were actually in the streets, right? In the streets and also in rooms. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just mass protest. It was political and cultural work happening and revolt happening in so many different registers at so many different scales. So that's happened. So that scramble happens, and the predictable thing that gets rolled out is, a seemingly unending sequence of boring, scripted, reformist responses, pretty much through 2021, right? I think it got intensified, especially at sites like universities. I wrote about this a little bit in the University of California because it was so boring that it actually taught me something, which is that the boringness of these institutional reform ventures is actually part of how they do counterinsurgency, right? They bore the shit out of you. The tedium, right? Like the appropriation and corporatization of certain terms, right? Like, I don't know how many times I read and heard the phrase, or something, the phrases like this, right? Innovating new forms of campus safety, right? Transformative approaches, to security and safety. Anyway, so you get that. So that happens throughout 2021. All right, so here's the punchline. So I'm gonna stop my soliloquy right now. Here's the punchline. All this reformist shit happens from the city council to the university to the federal government. They passed the George Floyd Act. A bunch of organizations that I'm part of, I was fighting with them because they're pushing all these reformist measures that I told them were the wrong thing to do. Other people are pushing for individual prosecutions of individual police officers. And I'm like, that's the wrong thing to do, et cetera. Here's the bottom line. If any of y'all know this project that a couple of journalists at the Washington Post have been doing for the last several years called the Fatal Force Project, right? They undertook this project years ago for those of you that don't know, because there's no national database of civilians that are killed by the police, right? Like of all the data that the state has on us, you know what I mean? Like they're in our Google, they're in our Siri, they're in our everything, they're in your email. They somehow have decided that they're not going to collect any reliable national data on how many, civilians are killed by the cops each year. So these folks at the Post had to do it. Punchline is this: in 2021 was the highest number of police killings in the history of the Fatal Force Project, right? So all of these kind of liberal reformist assumptions about how the unfolding of reformist scripts and ceremonies and rhetorics and ideological rituals was going to somehow discipline the cops and keep them from killing as many people, maybe even slow things down and fix shit. Or that's the point, right? Like we're waiting to fix things. Like suffer while this reformist thing gets some traction. Not only does it not get traction, but police killings actually empirically are emboldened by all this, right? And there's a whole logic that I can walk us through. I can talk about how body cameras actually, inarguably, they don't curb police violence, right? Arguably, they actually embolden it. And they create a new ideological and visual apparatus, right, to like try to suck people into the anti-Black and colonial drama of policing itself. I mean, so that's what I think we need to understand here, right? Is that if it's not just a kind of political ideological objection to reformism as such, which I also object to at that level, right? But it's also just looking at the empirical, compilation of what the casualties are, right? If the point is to stop the casualties, right? If it's to abolish casualties created by asymmetrical targeted domestic warfare, which is what policing is, especially in places like the United States, then we need to understand that reformism is actually part of, it's a kind of distension, it's a kind of deputized political and ideological apparatus of the war-making machine, domestic war-making machine that is policing. So that's where I think we need to understand we are, right? That's where we are in real time right now, April 28, 2022. We're in that right now.
Yep, I want to drill into a couple of things you just shared in your response to that first question, is specifically around sort of the discourse and the work and the policy and programs around violence prevention, right? I come into this dialogue, as a researcher, a community engaged researcher in the space of youth violence prevention and the prevention of youth exposure to violence. And I heard you speak to the ways in which we challenge and are challenging reformism, which is in and of itself a way in which violence manifests. At the same time, the work and the agenda around violence prevention is not looking in that direction. Can you talk a little bit more about, I guess at a very rudimentary level, where this discourse fits in the space of violence prevention, and how we're talking about and studying and understanding, the prevention of violence among youth, gun violence, domestic forms of violence and the like.
Yeah, I can talk about that in a couple different ways. I'm gonna try to be more concise with my responses, I promise, because I know we got a lot to get through, and I want to invite people to, get into it with us. So here, the first thing I would say about this is that, and I know you're dealing with this, right? Which is that with a lot of the work around violence prevention, both on the ground and in the kind of scholarly, theoretical and conceptual sphere, is a kind of confrontation with a certain paradigm of what is presumed by that concept of violence prevention, right? Like, first of all, what the violence is, right? I mean, I think we always got to start there, don't we? I mean, don't we always have to start with, like, let's define what the fucking violence is, right?
Yeah.
If the violence is like reduced to kind of preconceptual notions of it being relatively piecemeal, meaning like these are, relatively isolated rather than normalized forms of violence, right? Like these are not enmeshing, is, my good friend Eric Stanley just wrote this great book, right? And they write about atmosphere, like the atmospheres of violence, right? Violence is as atmospheric, just mind blowing stuff. We think so part of it is addressing what is behind what presumptions are behind, paradigmatic presumptions are behind the terms, because those paradigmatic presumptions end up becoming the MO. Okay, so like so that's what we're dealing with, right? Like that's what we're confronting, is violence prevention becomes really, what it really is triage, which is another way to put it. And I've been saying this for years now in the context of like taking the framework that, current former US political prisoners, Black revolutionaries, Puerto Rican independentistas and others have been talking about years, talking about domestic warfare, right? Asymmetrical domestic warfare. Like violence prevention is really talking about casualty management. Right. So like, I think it's okay. So that's to say, I'm not going to come for violence prevention in its current form. I'm not coming for it that way. Right. I'm saying we need to just be honest about what it really is. Right. That it's really not violence prevention, that what we're actually dealing with is casualty management. And here's some of the most honest and like insightful and radical liberatory revolutionary people that have thought about this are Amika Tendayi and Martine Caverill in Chicago, who co-founded Ujima Medics, right? So like they don't call so Ujima Medics, their primary concern was that they were tired of seeing Black folks in Southside Chicago dying prematurely because the state was not coming to help them. I mean, I'm being like really crystallized about what they do. I'll put the link up in the chat in a second. Like, give them your support. They're outstanding. They're amazing people. But they like didn't take much digging them to figure out the two main causes of premature preventable Black death were, number one, gunshot wounds that were not fatal. Non-fatal gunshot wounds would become fatal because of a lack of care. 911, Flavor Flav said it years ago, for those of us that are old enough, right? Flavor Flav talked about 911, right? So we know what 911 means for Black folks, especially in places like Southside Chicago. So Black people were dying from what should have been non-fatal gunshot wounds. So they're dealing with that. And then the other major cause of death is asthma attacks. Okay, so like in terms of dealing with this, right? And they're at a certain level, what they're dealing with is casualty management, right? They're like, we want to prevent Black death, right? Because the state will not do it. The state's neglect is part of the embedded anti-Blackness of the state. Okay, so the work that they do, it's casualty management, but it's also tied to a deeper community organizing pedagogy that demystifies the state, right? Like it divests people of that self-destructive faith that the state can somehow be cajoled and convinced to step up and do its job, which is what the kind of liberal reformist script always is. Okay, so like I look at examples like that and say that actually is instructive, because it helps those of us that are in the kind of violence prevention world to kind of demystify the terms that we're being forced to work with and just address it as what Ujima Medics is doing, which is like, they're trying to build community around it too, right? So it's not this kind of cynical thing, it's just casualty man. No. This thing, it is a deep care, right? A sense of deep care for the community and for the people who you're tied with. To say that like we're changing the ways in which we understand what we're doing as casualty management, and we do it because we have an analysis of the state. We have an analysis of what Eric Stanley would call atmospheric violence. So there's that. The second thing I would say is that a direct, I think, and productive rebuttal of the violence prevention, of the kind of dominant violence prevention paradigm in the triage approach is that we need to foreground the terms of insecurity. That I found was one of the things that the proponents of kind of police reformist measures throughout 2021, that's a thing that on the one hand was irrefutable, right? Because the reformists walk into their own limitations, okay? Because they want to introduce these rhetorics about, Benji put it up there, reimagining policing, all that crap, right? That abolitionists have been saying for years, but they want to expropriate it and turn it into a liberal reformist, kind of program. So, but at the same time, they kind of lay their own trap in a sense, because now what you can actually talk about is, okay, y'all introduced these things, so let's really talk about what endangers people now, right? Like why is it that you have displaced, unhoused people, mentally unwell people, whatever, right? And it also I should come back for that. There's this whole notion that we need to challenge all the time, which is that people who are uncared for, right, who are mentally ill or mentally disabled, are somehow inherently dangerous and criminal. You know what I mean? Like that's the primary, you know what I mean? Like everybody who's got, it's like, I have mental disorders and emotional problems. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it's right to just name and identify me automatically as dangerous, criminal, et cetera, right? So like, there's all that needs to be dealt with. And the way you deal with this is by foregrounding the language and the concept of insecurity in a deep and rigorous way. And so folks, they lay their own trap because they can't actually challenge that. Now you got to start talking about housing insecurity, health insecurity, educational insecurity, recreational insecurity, right? Like this is that's some good friends, collaborators of mine. They start talking about recreation, like play, right? Like people can't access play, recreation, playtime, joy. You know what I mean? So there's all these robust levels of insecurity that are embedded in the kind of U.S. nation building project, right? Like at all its scales. The hemispheric civilizational project at all its scales. That then forces the conversation into a totally different register, right? Now violence prevention becomes, okay, let's prevent insecurity, right? How do you prevent insecurity? It's like, okay, cool, right? Because that's where the violence is coming from, and it's shooting out in all these different ways. Then the last thing I'll say about this is that to the extent that we don't do those things, right? To the extent that we kind of allow these triage-based violence prevention paradigms to remain intact without constant pushback and challenge and constant demystification, then what it actually invites is police involvement, right? Like not just the involvement of the state, but actually directly involves, by at most 1 degree of separation, directly involves the presence and participation of the police, right? I mean, that was one of the main parts of the reformist script, especially on campuses, was delegating tasks that used to be put on the cops, meaning responding to people who are having like a mental health crisis, right? So a lot of campuses are saying, oh, we're going to send like professional trained mental health care workers to go do that. But if you read the directives and you read the protocols, like they're basically deputized as extensions of the police, which is to say that they're told as soon as X, Y, or Z happens, it's all very subjective, of course. As soon as you feel X, Y, and Z is happening, call the cops, right? So it's like, that's what I mean by at most 1 degree separated, right? You actually have an expansion. You have an expansion of police power where now non-police, right? You have unarmed people without badges, but they're direct extensions. They're essentially deputies of police power. So you've actually expanded the base of police power. And frankly, people are not comfortable with that. Like those who are because many of these folks, many of these healthcare workers, they're actually part of the movement, right? And many of them are abolitionists or at least proto-abolitionists and understand what it is that they're being told to do. So there's some kind of internal fracturing with that we need to honor as well. So yeah, the violence prevention thing is deep. I think it is part and parcel of everything we're talking about. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And to that point, to kind of and you, Benji, I thank you for dropping what you just dropped in the chat, because I want us to, my next couple of questions is for you, Dylan, is I want you to respond to and talk about where we are with abolition and understanding it, defining it, and the work that still needs to be done. And in a very specific way on our college and university campuses, but also in our elementary and secondary schools as well, because there is a major police presence that is precipitating and causing a lack of a sense of safety, particularly in Black and Brown and Indigenous children in schools. So if you can talk a bit about abolition movements and how they're rooted and grounded in struggles against anti-Black oppression, and then sort of the language we're using around abolitionist movements and the ideas of and practice of abolition and reframing the reformist narratives with abolitionist language and thinking.
I feel like we got to start every conversation when abolition comes up. We got to start every conversation by just, deeply reminding ourselves that abolition means diasporic Black revolutionary tradition. Like that's what it is. It'll never not be that centrally. And it is absolutely critical to resist any temptation that a lot of people have, and they have different reasons for doing this, for kind of abstracting abolition from that ongoing diasporic revolutionary practice, right? And it's dynamic and it's beautifully queer. You know what I mean? Like it's increasingly trans, it's not one thing. It's this kind of changing, moving praxis that's so collective and diasporic. And it's like internally contested. People argue and debate about it with each other. That's what I mean by beautiful. I don't mean it's like without contentiousness. I mean, it's like, it's actually full of argument. It's full of thought. It's full of collective study. So that's number one, right? Like when we think about abolition, that's what we need to understand it being. And we also, for those of us who are, non-Black, especially non-Black people of color, so-called people of color, who are engaged with it, part of the tradition, what Cedric Robinson has famously, named the Black radical tradition, is that there's this kind of constant gesture of capaciousness, of grace, and of invitation to people like me to be fully engaged and practicing, like with and alongside African descended people who are engaged in the Black radical tradition, right? So like that's one of the characteristic and defining aspects of this practice. It comes with a sense of shared responsibility and accountability and that kind of thing, right? But I think it is something that is kind of different and I would argue is probably unique to that diasporic Black radical and revolutionary tradition and abolitionist praxis as a whole. So I'll talk about a couple things in terms of thinking through abolition in the terms of, how would I describe it to somebody? You know what I mean? Like who's kind of coming into contact with it, wants to be engaged, or maybe is already engaged and just, I think we always need a reminder. You know what I mean? Like we need a reminder, we need to embolden ourselves all the time. And like, here's why we need to continue and sustain this work and spread this work of abolition. Well, on the one hand, I think many of my friends and colleagues and teachers have repeatedly said for at least 20 years now, like Angela Davis, Ruthie Gilmore, my friend Miriam Kaba, like all the folks whose names you probably know if you've been engaged in abolitionist thinking and study recently. They and we talk all the time about abolition is about community. It's about creating community. It's Ruthie's famously said it's about presence. You know what I mean? And it's about making things. Like I've talked about it as a practice of radical creativity. I've talked, so it's a productive world making, community creating experiment, right? But it's an experiment in the rigorous sense that scientists and artists talk about it. You know what I mean? Like people talk about experiments like it's just the scientific world. No, man, like science, some scientists would also call what they do art, right? Like you talk to a quantum physicist, it's like half that shit is like a narrative adventure. You know what I mean? So like I'm saying, like let's melt that down a little bit, these distinctions, and think about experiment in those ways, right? It's artistic, it's scientific, it's everything in between and beyond, both those things. So I think abolition is absolutely that. It's about world making. It's about taking everything that we were just talking about in our first few minutes here, right? And like extending that into the conversations about, okay, so what possibilities do we find in the rubble of the police station? All right, like that's what I think ought to excite us about a certain historical moment, right? Like certainly there's joy. There's joy in militant self-defense. There's joy in destroying your oppressor. I'm down for that all day and all night. Like I feel that that's probably that's probably where I'm at most of the time, right? Like that's where I feel the best and I feel the most joy, right? And I'm going to say the creative community building stuff because it's important and I know I want to do it. But that, in a way, that work is only made possible. It's only made possible by the second dimension of abolition that I'm going to emphasize. That I feel like it's probably the right time to do this. And I feel like it's my role, one of, me and others. I think it's maybe some of our role to do this, which is say that abolition should also not be abstracted from its beautifully destructive necessities. Mm. Okay, so like, I want to resist the temptation that I think marks a lot of these conversations to somehow pathologize destruction, to distance abolition from the necessary destruction that it historically entails, and to put exclusive emphasis on the creative presence, community. Like, can we please think about these things together simultaneously in all their complexity? All right, because and this is what I'm going to say about this is I've been in these conversations and kind of very collegial and loving debates with people around this destruction piece, right? Because I've been like fixated on it a little bit in the last year or so, because I'm like, man, we got to stop. We got to like go back to that, right? We have to honor how abolition is about destruction. People were creating communities of insurgency and fugitivity because in part, they needed to burn the plantation down. They needed to destroy the slaveholding society. I mean, like there was no other way to exist unless you destroyed those things. I mean, let's, and then we talk about the colonial regime. It's like you can't deal with this unless you repulse the occupiers. I mean, they have to go, right? We could go on down the line. Anyway, I realized that part of I think the challenge is how we understand the concept of destruction, not unlike how we think about violence, right? That we always think about violence a certain kind of way. So, this is where I owe a real debt of gratitude to the folks who've been involved with this movement in New York City called Strike MoMA. It's an amazing community of artists. I'll put the link up also for that. But the community of artists based in New York who have challenged the entire apparatus of the art community and like the museum, regime, expose how it's tied to, coloniality and slaveholding. Like the entire thing is like a direct reflection of the massive Western civilizational imperial project, right? But what that community of artists has reminded me and taught me is that destruction is part of an artistic and creative process. You cannot, like material artists, visual artists, performing artists, etc. You cannot have these brilliant works of creativity, right? These brilliant contributions to aesthetic and visuality and sound and movement and all the rest. You cannot have any of that without destructiveness. You know what I mean? I think about those who were involved in different forms of material art, right? Like some of them rely on destroyed things to actually constitute their sculptures, right? Like I've been privileged to know a few people who have worked with like found art, like found items and that kind of, like they'll go to dumps and look at things that have been destroyed. And other folks will actually actively destroy things to create the possibility for their art. So I think about that. This great artist sent me something that was, his name's Ryan Hawk, based in Texas. He sent me this great piece that he created. It was based on, I think it's the second chapter of my book where I'm talking about Barry Goldwater. I'm looking at Barry Goldwater's archive. And I talk about this fucked up tattoo that he had that was reflecting his membership in this weird fake, a fake like white men's native tribe in Arizona called the Smoke Eye people. It was like white guys. It was like white business people that created a fake tribe and they got these weird tattoos. So I wrote about that in the book. So Ryan Hawk creates this like really, creepy, scary, but like beautiful piece of art that looks, it looks like a piece of ripped off white flesh with the Barry Goldwater tattoo on it, and he pinned it up on like this. I have it downstairs. I wish I could bring it up here right now. I'll show it to you, right? So it's like it actually shows like a subjection of white flesh to tearing and destruction, right? Okay, so there's something about destruction that I think is really critical when we think about abolition. We got to think about that all the time. And then as far as colleges, universities, and K through 12 go, I just dropped something in the chat, the Cops Off Campus movement, which I'm happy to be part of. I'm still part of it. But this is one direct way that abolition movements are getting traction and continuing to stain and unfold at the sites of universities, junior colleges, liberal arts colleges, private, public, et cetera, right? All scales of higher education, this movement is happening. And that the reason that link is so great is because creating a chapter is as easy as just looking at that link, right? Boom, you're done. K through 12, you need to go no further than, well, there's multiple examples, but the one that I'm most familiar with is something called, took about 10, 12 years if you talk to folks, but Jessica Black, I got the pleasure to meet her last fall. She was one of the principal organizers in the Oakland Unified School District for the Black Organizing Project. And they effectively, it took them 10 years, but they effectively abolished police presence in the Oakland Unified School District. An incredible, I mean, can you imagine? Like they canceled the contract, right? Like they're now in the midst of like the hard work of trying to construct a different type of infrastructure to keep kids secure and safe. And like they're actually having deep conversations about security and safety against insecurity, against the deep forms of systemic violence as we think about, systems and are in the way that I was asking us to. So this work is happening. I think abolition is not some kind of far off endpoint or outcome. It's actually a praxis. It's actually something that people do right now, real time. And something that I think folks can and should embrace and be involved with, in a collective way. It always, that's the thing, right? It's inherently a collective practice. I think we need to resist the way kind of clout thirst, among all kind of people, whether they're in the nonprofit industrial complex or the academic industrial complex, like they'll kind of chase down abolition and attach themselves to it because they see some entrepreneurial outcome that's, profitable for them. So we have to name that. Right. I'm not just talking about the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation. That's just one example. There are many examples of this, especially among academics. Like look at the grants people are getting recently from like major philanthropic foundations, and like distinguish, right? Like how many of these folks are connected to any form of collective work that's, that you could name as somehow at least friendly to abolition, and how many have just really found a way to expropriate the term. So I think there's dangers here as well. And I think we need to be rigorous and analytical and, and incessant about it, right? We have to be incessant about the collective responsibility that comes with abolitionist work of all kinds.
I want to go here, given that point, just the importance of us, that collective responsibility in doing abolitionist work. I know on the Tulane University campus, there is active student organizing to abolish the Tulane University Police Department. That work is happening. It's very real. But I think it would also be helpful for this audience for you to talk about and speak to for folks on a university campus and beyond, sort of starting their work in the space of abolition, organizing, abolition movement building. What are some of the first steps? What might first steps look like in an institution of higher education? What might first steps look like in a community-based or more grassroots setting, and other settings as well?
I have tools that I can share. They're free. They're like a great way to kind of convene people around them. I've been really happy to be part of this group of folks through the national, to some extent, transnational abolitionist organization that's been around now since 2022, right? Shoot, we're going on 25 years, something like that. Critical Resistance. I'll put the link up in a second. But yeah, it's been around for a while. I've actually been really privileged to be part of it since its founding. And there's a group of us that are kind of a subgroup called the Critical Resistance Abolitionist Educators. So a small little example, right? But something that I think is shareable and people can work with. We created a resource guide in the fall in 2021, partly in response to what we saw as misappropriations of of a lot of abolitionist thinking and scholarship that, you know, goes back, right? Not just recent stuff, but stuff that goes back to like, you know, Du Bois and even, you know, prior to that, right? So part of it was we wanted to build a resource guide that offered a corrective to the way we thought some folks were kind of misinterpreting and moving in the wrong directions with what they were naming as abolitionist thought, study, collective analysis, and so forth. Which is to say this, one of the first steps is actually necessarily, it's to convene and focus on collective study, right? I think there's a tendency in particularly in the post-1970s US-based, you know, foundation philanthropic nonprofit configuration of, I think, both defining and periodically openly infiltrating so grassroots social movements to fixate on spectacles of public performance, mass demonstration, and so forth, right? And like, you know, there's a whole, any of y'all that have ever been involved in that stuff with organizations that are part of the NPIC, which I'm part of many of them, right? Like there's a whole script to it, right? Like we decide what the objectives are, we decide who's vulnerable, who's not gonna be part of the march, we go get the permit from the cops, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole thing. So that's just one thing, right? But there's a weird way that when we think about building movements, I think we get solicited and seduced into thinking that that's how you prove the movement exists, right? Is to engage in those spectacles of mass public demonstration, which are, you know, they're you know, they're scripted, right? And like, and the thing is, they end up becoming disciplinary activities as well, because then you have to like, well, number one, you want to make sure you don't get infiltrated by people who are going to try to like bring danger on you, which happens all the time, right? And on the other hand, like, you know, the kind of respectability, you know, academic liberalism steps in and says, okay, stop cursing, right? Don't cuss the cops out. Don't say you want to burn the police station down. Like, okay, so we're going to keep, so that's what I mean by it becomes a disciplinary activity, right? So like that, in many ways, that's the opposite of what a radical movement, of what should animate, I should say, of what should animate a radical movement, right? A radical movement should always like be ready to slide out of control of those who would want to control it. I mean, that's what it, and like, I can say I've been in those spaces too, right? And that danger is the most beautiful fucking thing imaginable, right? When we all can feel like the danger that we don't know what's on the other end of what we might do right now, or what some of us might do. Now we got to have your back, because I'm not willing to do what you're going to do, but now I also know I got to have your back. Right? So like, there's all that. So thinking about all that means that there has to be some rigor in how we understand the kind of collective shared premises of communing, of action, of organizing, of, for that matter, mass demonstration. That only happens through convening and sustaining a convening around forms of collective study, right? Now, I want to encourage that collective study is and should be experimental, right? It doesn't necessarily look like what we're doing right now, although I think we are doing that right now in a certain kind of way. It's a limited way, but we're doing it, right? There's no perfect way to engage in collective study, but I think that there are so many tools that one can make use of to engage in collective study, and we need to like understand it as that and be unapologetic about doing that. And here's why. If you look at, you know, I'm going to be simplistic about it, but if you look at the other side, right? I mean, there's a big other side, right? There's like there's a whole spectrum to the other side, from the liberals to the far right, you know, that want to squash abolition for many different kind of reasons, like many of them shared. But that other side, you can bet your ass that most of them, right? Like most of the organized, you know, kind of blocks on that spectrum of the other side, they study the fuck out of us. They actually read the texts that we read. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you saw, I forgot which general it was. You saw the general that testified in Congress, I think at the beginning of this year. Like he read Che Guevara, you mean like he's read all these revolutionary texts, he read Francois, like he was citing these people in his congressional testimony, talking about, oh yeah, no, we read all these texts of these revolutionaries and these insurgents, right? We need to know what they do, and we need to have like a kind of analysis and theory of what they do so that we can squash them, so we can engage in counterinsurgency effectively. So like, that whole spectrum of the other side, they engage in rigorous study all the time. Just the difference that they get think tanks. You know what I mean? Like they actually have think tanks. You know what I mean? Like they have, you know, people that they'll pluck out of what we call academia and send over there to kind of do that work, like literally alongside state officials, you know, military, you know, military officials and administrators and others. So for people who are engaged in trying to build abolitionist movement, to not engage in collective rigorous study is actually it's self-destructive, right? So I think that's a necessary first step, is to convene around some form of collective study, and also enjoy it, y'all. Like it shouldn't be homework in the bad sense. It should be play as much as homework, right? It's like you should enjoy yourselves as you do it. So find a way to experimentally engage in forms of collective study that are rigorous and serious, but also like induce a sense of participation and joy and community, right? I think that's one of the strongest ways that people build community with each other. And then I think the stuff that you do through study that way proliferates, right? Like I'm thinking about the artist communities, right? Like artists, different kinds of artists, right? Artist communities that do. I've been invited into conversations with different artist communities, small and large, that are doing this work of collective study, and it has direct implications for how they're both creating the art that they do and organizing it, right? So they're what they're thinking about is how to weaponize and aestheticize themselves and what they do as creators as part of an expanding and dynamic abolitionist praxis, right? So it's mind blowing. And I'm invited into conversation just to kind of bounce ideas around, and they share what they're doing with me. Like that's what I'm saying. That's what collective study sometimes looks like that. So when I say that, it's not necessarily just like taking the resource guide I'm about to drop in chat and like reading it together. Although I want you to do that, you know what I mean? But that's not necessarily what it is. Like y'all can watch shoot, man, like if you end up building toward the analysis to do it, like take a look at how media and social media narratives are being constructed around these ongoing, incessant video spectacles of police violence. Most of it, you know, that we see nowadays is like a lot of it's fatal, right? Like you could actually convene a group and engage in collective study, just analyzing what happened, what are the conditions, like what is being said around these visual images of fatality and death. And so like that's not for everybody, but I'm saying like that's one form it could take. On and on. That's what I'm talking about. Collective study, I think is really critical. And I'll post that resource guide right now in the chat while I'm listening to your to the next provocation, next question.
Yeah. And I want to also just state at this point that participants, we invite you to drop in the chat any questions, comments. I have seen a couple of comments, and even unmute yourself to get in on this dialogue. I'm gonna read out what one participant dropped into the chat, Corinne. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. There's something really freeing in depending on that community care when sliding out of control from those in power trying to control us. And I thought that was a very compelling and powerful statement from Corinne. Thank you. Any other participants want to jump in at this point?
I'm sorry, Samantha. I'm going to put in the chat a question that came to me from one of the participants.
Yeah, great. Okay. That did not get emailed. New Orleans recently elected District Attorney Jason Williams, who has established a civil rights division to review prior convictions, which has led to a number of exonerations and releases, but there have also been significant concessions made that he's been criticized for publicly, like charging juveniles as adults. Within this framework of reformism, would you share your thoughts about the push to elect progressive DAs throughout the country? Great question.
Yeah, there's actually a movement to run abolitionist prosecutors, believe it or not. I was invited into a conversation with folks involved in that movement. A lot of it's situated in the Northwest in the U.S. Northwest area. But no, actually, I take it back. It wasn't abolitionist DAs. It was abolitionist sheriffs, where it's just like, half an office removed from the DA. But I mean, it's an analogous, I think, kind of logic. So I think what I would, and of course, there's the example of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, who had the moment in which he was actually elected as basically an abolitionist district attorney, and of course he faced all of the relatively predictable backlash from an entire spectrum of organized people and just prominent people as well. Nonetheless, I think we need to understand that there's no such thing as there's no such thing as a DA that is there's no such thing as a DA that's going to not incarcerate people. So it's like, right. So I mean, we just have to understand that, right? Like, let's get our minds around like what we're actually choosing is, the relative intensity of and relative asymmetry of the state violence that we're condoning. You know what I mean? So like, just being real about that is the first thing, because here's my fear, right? And I appreciate this question a lot. My fear is that as much as we tell ourselves that investing a lot of resources, time, energy, collective labor around something like an electoral campaign, right, for a progressive DA, abolitionist DA, or whatever, that as much as we tell ourselves that we know what the limitations are, right? Like it's still a DA, you know what I mean? There's a way that convening and communing around that work it kind of toxifies our political imagination in a way that it makes sense, because we've just invested our blood and our energy in doing this, you know what I mean, and actually electing a DA that we think is going to be basically less bad. That to me is the political challenge, right? So like I'm all for it, like in principle. I'm all for it in principle. I'm all for the movement to try to run and maybe even elect abolitionist sheriffs. Cool, right? If that means like X number of people, I mean, it's basically like what people would call a non-reformist reform, right? Like to get to get people who are explicitly progressive and or abolitionists and get them into these offices where the job is actually to become the official of state violence. It's a non-reformist reform, because what you're doing is it's a form of casualty management, right? So I think that there's something about how we frame the support around this that needs to address the distinction between abolition-friendly reform and reformism, right? And understand that there's a way that electing any DA or sheriff is almost always going to come back to reformism, which means that you need to reignite your opposition to the person you just elected, right? And so there's something about that as well, where it's even and especially when there is some modest success, like with Chesa, right? With Chesa Boudin, like we don't need to defend him either, right? Like let's say you actually elect a progressive DA. So if you look at what Williams is doing in New Orleans, right? I've only followed it a little bit. Like I'm not nearly as in the weeds and on the ground as y'all are. But there has to be like an unapologetic, full-throated criticism of what he does in relation to so-called juveniles, right? Like coming for kids like that, right? That it can't hesitate. It can't hesitate because the point is that office can't be anything but that, right? And frankly, I think there has to be a rhetorical approach to this as well that says, okay, so like exonerations and revisiting past, that's the least you could fucking do. We are not grateful to you for that, right? Like that's your job and it's the least you could do. Like we know you didn't necessarily create it. We got you there to do this work, but like that's your job. That's why you get paid the big bucks, right? That's why you get the fancy office, right? That's why you get the protection of the state. That's why you get the fancy title. It's like, that is the least you could do. So, as you can tell, I'm really ambivalent about all of it, right? But I'm mostly ambivalent about the fact that our folks that get involved in those movements, they get fixated and preoccupied with those things. And that's the thing that I think ends up becoming kind of counterinsurgent, as energy and thought and imagination gets taken away from other practices, other forms of collective work.
Yeah, the organizing work has to, there's an evolution of it, right? Like we may be organizing to get you in office. Now we need to organize to hold you accountable. I see Sarah's hand, Sarah Melman.
Thanks, Dr. Francois. Yeah, I put my hand up and then Fabiana and Uma posted in the chat, and then I posted in the chat too. So I'll leave it up to Dr. Rodriguez to go in the order that he thinks makes the most sense for the flow of the conversation, if that's all right with you.
Yes, yes.
Oh, so you tell me I gotta go read the questions, huh?
Unless you want me to read them out loud, or
Oh, no, I want you
I
to direct me. No, y'all direct me. Y'all tell me what to do. I'm here for you. I'm here to do what you tell me to do.
So Sarah, won't you go ahead with yours, and then I'll loop back to Fabiana's.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate y'all. Thank you so much for this talk and everything. I'm not gonna belabor that point because we don't have that much time, but this is awesome. So thank you. Dr. Rodriguez, in the beginning of your talk today, you mentioned the importance of highlighting the violence of what you called effective spiritual systems. Can you speak to those terms effective and spiritual, especially as related to the term magical you used to describe reformist fantasies of an institutional fix? And I'm an anthropologist, so sorry for the deep dive into theory I just took.
No, I love it. No, I love
Okay,
it.
thank you.
No, it's so important. I always appreciate being like asked to, elaborate some dense stuff that I just say. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so like I count on you.
perfectly.
I count on you to do that. No, I count on you
Stuck
to
with me
like
this whole time, so thank you.
right on. Thank you. No, that's so the thing about the magic of reformism is that it's like it's a white. I think I call it in the article. I think I call it white magic. I think I call it white magic. It's like it's a civilizational white magic, right? And the magic of it is that what reformism does is that it turns what seems to be a limited policy proposal or agenda into something that is so much more than a policy agenda, right? It turns into what, to use those terms, right? It turns into an affective and spiritual commitment, right? And it's a commitment of belief. It's not just of labor and of political organizing, all that. It's of belief, and that shit takes work. That's the magic of it, right? That's the magic of it. The magic of it is that it convinces. It does more than convince. It draws people in. It's like a kind of affective and spiritual center of gravity, right? Where now that you're engaged in doing the reformist venture, like in playing out the reformist wager, you have to believe in it. So I'll tell you like an example of this that I struggled with throughout the year, most of the calendar year, pretty much the whole calendar year of 2021 and beyond. I was part of a coalition, still am part of a coalition called Justice for Angelo Quinto, Justice for All, right? Angelo Quinto was a 30-year-old Filipino-American guy. He was killed by the police in the Bay Area around Christmas. I think it was around Christmas 2020. Right. And it was with the same chokehold that was used to, on George Floyd. Right. So coalition forms of Filipino American organizations. OK, like these organizations that really have never engaged in not only have they not really engaged in abolitionist work, they don't really engage in radical work. Right. They're not engaged, like they're kind of community organizations. They maybe do some advocacy work for Filipino American community. Like they go and they'll talk to California state legislature every now and then. So it's like pretty moderate, liberal, maybe progressive organizations were the ones who kind of were populating this coalition. So a good friend, old friend of mine asked me to join the coalition because they're like, yeah, we need, we need to have somebody around who has done work around police violence and brings abolitionist perspective to this and whatnot. And like, one of my former students right away checked out of the organization, and she told me, she's like, look, like, I don't have time for this. Like, I know who these folks are. Good luck to you. Right. I was like, cool. Okay. I'll do my best. Right. She's like, I've just had enough of dealing with those organizations. Like, I can't do it. So like, if you got the backbone to do it, like, go for it. Like, I just can't do it. And she was, of course, like, I knew she was going to be right. You know what I mean? But the biggest obstacle in trying to work with people is that, on the one hand, it seemed like most of the folks agreed with abolitionist principles, right? So it wasn't the same thing that I felt a lot of abolitionist folks were confronting in the late 90s into the 2000s, which is people who just didn't want to have anything to do with it, right? In this case, it was people like, yeah, abolition, cool. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do abolition. But there was a reformist magic that was actually playing out, which is conversations with legislators, a policy reform that was named after Angelo Quinto that like banned certain chokeholds, right? That was the principal achievement of the coalition, right? And it happened through one of the advocacy organizations, Filipino American advocacy organizations. But the sense of political, and this is affective spiritual, but it's also about the imaginary. The political imagination of the coalition could never quite get beyond the kind of stock piecemeal blueprints of legislative reformism, right? And it wasn't a political opposition or reaction against abolition that much, right? There were some people that were whatever, but most people actually had affinity to abolitionist principles, but it was at the level of imagination that there was a block, right? And it was practical as well. It wasn't just imagination, it was imagination. It was simultaneously both, right? Because folks didn't have, and we were also all online, right? It was middle of the pandemic still. So convening was hard, but like the problem was that the affective part is that folks were unwilling to break away from the scripts of faith and loyalty in their state officials. So like one of the principal gatherings that actually did happen was in the city that Angelo Quinto was killed in, and they brought out the mayor. You know what I mean? Like they had the family there, and the family's script of response to to Angelo's death was what you hear a lot of families saying. We want the police officer prosecuted. We want X, Y, and Z. I was like, okay, that's cool. They have the right to demand whatever they want. Like our job, if we're going to be serious about trying to undertake some, fulfilling some abolitionist principles here, is to not necessarily always just be in automatic agreement with what the family wants, right? But like we are at liberty to like push the envelope in a different direction and say, we actually want X, Y, and Z, right? Like we want something so that because the point I made to people is that if the goal is for something like this to never happen again, right? Like that's the bare minimum, right? That's the bare minimum commitment for it to never happen again. People like, yeah, we're on board with that. Okay, well then prosecuting an individual cop or two cops doesn't do that, right? Banishing the chokehold over and over again for the last 30 years does not do that. That's empirical. That's not even speculative. That's empirical at this point. So like, what the fuck are we doing, right? What the fuck are we doing? So when I talk about the magic of reformism, it's that, right? Like on the ground, it's that mess. It's that mess. And that's why I think, one of the probably the fundamental problem that a lot of coalitions like this have is that we never engage in collective study. We never did it. A couple of us were pushing for it, but I think folks were too tied into the kind of scripts of, kind of nonprofit industrial complex type organizing, which was, you have like the one major spectacle event, in the city, where and it's Antioch, by the way. The city's called Antioch in the Bay Area. Where you get the Antioch mayor and city council people and the family up on a stage and get them to talk and expose their feelings and all this stuff. And there was a concert as well, which was great because it raised funds for the family. But in terms of actually trying to develop a robust collective analysis and politics of what we were doing, the fact that we never convened that, there was a little bit too much apathy around that, meant that the ultimate outcome was the ultimate success, nominal success, was passing a California bill that was named after Angelo Quinto that will accomplish nothing, right? It'll accomplish nothing. In fact, the last thing I'll say about it is that the last convening we had as a group was with the family. And at this point, I'm constant. I get really stressed out at this point when I'm with the group because, because so much of what I'm experiencing with what we're doing is bullshit. And this time the family was there, and I, put on my most generous performance of this, right? But I told everybody, it's like because it was kind of wrapping up our comments and our thoughts for what we had accomplished in 2021. And to paraphrase what I think I said was something around that, the fact that I think we all need to really take an inventory and be really careful and self-critical about what we think we've accomplished, right? Because oftentimes when we accomplish certain things, they don't have the effects that we think that they will have. I think I said something like that, right? And I said it directly to the family and to the organizations that had passed the Angelo Kinto bill. And then I referred to the very same thing I referred to at the start of this conversation, which is in 2021, the cops killed more people. And the thing about it though, y'all, is like everyone's minds were blown by that, right? Nobody knew that. And actually my old friend actually kind of like was hating on, kind of doubted me, thought I was making that shit up. She was like, could you like show me the evidence of that? And so I did. And then like everybody just kind of didn't know what to say. Right. But I'm saying like, that's the magic. That's the white magic of it all. It's like we did that for over a year. And like now we're back here. Right. That's the white magic.
Yes, indeed. I want to read out Fabia and Uma's question, and I think it is still definitely relevant given where the dialogue is gone. But I think they were asking it at the time we were talking about sort of these reforms or reformist practices, specifically in criminal legal systems. But they asked, how do these types of programs, goals differ from reform when they are still based in the system that we aim to obstruct? Do you believe you can still be part of the system and be working within the abolitionist paradigm?
Yeah, that was me. And I was just wondering also within the context of like this non-reformist reform and like maybe just pushing back on that a little bit, just to hear, your thoughts on it. And I was thinking of people like, this is different because it's like not particularly a radical person, but postured as a radical person, like AOC being seen as like a socialist, infiltrating Congress, etc.
Right.
Really just kind of becoming a pawn of the system. So that kind of, context is where I was thinking about this non-reformist reform.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think that non-reformist reforms is a phrase. Ruthie popularized it among abolitionist communities, but she cited somebody else whose name I can't remember. But I think that there's a way that I've experienced that phrase being misappropriated to really just talk about reforms. You know what I mean? It's like non-reformist reforms are really just reforms, and reformist reforms, right? So like, but we're in that moment where like, this is why I was insisting on collective study, because like we need to, our primary weapon is like sharp shared analysis. If you have a sharp and shared analysis, then you can interrupt the bullshit from jump. And that is so important, because as soon as the premises are set up in a conversation or a collective organization, like it's really hard to push back against the premises once they've been established. So I think if our different communities of abolitionists and proto-abolitionists, movement creators, are together and trying to think through things together and have a relatively shared and sharp analysis, that helps to challenge and make untenable things like what you were just talking about. I think that was Fabiana talking, not Uma, right? Because I had Fabiana and Uma, right?
Fabiana, yeah.
Got you. So I think that's why I was insisting on that, because that's what I think is almost always missing, and that ends up being what undermines kind of the basic political integrity of what we're trying to do. So to get at the question a little bit, I'm gonna go back to something that one of my early mentors talked to me about. Professor James Turner, one of the the founder of Africana Studies at Cornell University, like was one of the people who studied under Malcolm X, like a long time, radical Black nationalist and all kinds of that stuff. I mean, he had so much wisdom and insights that he shared with me during my time as a student. And I asked him a question like this as I was leaving that institution, because I was just constantly in awe of how he was able to just survive the deep anti-Black and white supremacist hostility that he was faced with over and over again during his, at that point, going on 25 years there. And he was also addressing this question about what it means to inhabit a particular kind of institution, meaning, an elite university, but still be militant and consistent in his commitment to, Black radicalism, Black liberation struggle of various forms. And he said something that was, I think, really, it seems simple, but it's actually really insightful, and it gets at your question. He said at this point in kind of the historical development of institutions, it's really hard to think of a way to not be enmeshed in the system, right? Whether we call it empire or neoliberalism or something else, right? Like it's a pretty comprehensive system. It kind of reaches and touches and enfolds and coerces everybody, almost everybody, I should say. Like not everybody, but almost everybody. So it's hard not to be in a system. So we said like on the one, so like maybe the thing to start from is whether you're for or against it. It's like, it seems so simple, right? But like, but if you really, now that I've been a professor for 21, going on 22 years, about to be 22 years, right? Like it's actually a more complicated and difficult question than it seems, because you end up being in these systems, you end up identifying with them, you end up defending and protecting them. Your politics and your work ends up being limited to working within them. So like that sometimes is not being against it, right? It's actually being at least complicit with it, if not for it. So like to really be asking that question is one that I think produces other kinds of possibility, right? To say that, okay, so I'm inhabiting a particular system, am I for it or am I against it? Like that's a starting point. The other thing I'll say about this as well is that thinking about people who work within the law, work within universities and so forth, like there's actually an obligation or responsibility to work against those systems as you inhabit them, because in a sense, you're well situated in the belly of that beast to be a radically disruptive force, right? And I'm not saying that that's the be all and end all. I'm saying that might just be a starting point. It might just be a catalyst, right? And I'm not saying that it's all about you. It's not, right? You might be a small, modest contribution, right, to a larger wave of productive destruction, of abolitionist creation and so forth, right? So I'm saying it's a small role. I'm not saying it's a principal or central role. It's a small role, but I think it's potentially important if you can actually mount some momentum among yourselves and other people who are willing and capable to engage in that form of disruption. So in all these systems that we're talking about, they have these internal contradictions. They have all kinds of things that make them habitable in violent ways, right? I'm not saying it's ever not that, right? But they make them habitable in different kinds of ways, with like some limited forms of autonomy, some limited forms of relative, liberation, freedom, and convening. So we just need to take advantage of all those possibilities and exploit them and push them to their fullest extent. I mean, I think that's just a necessity. I think that puts stress on the system. The worst thing is just to consent to the logic and the normalization of these systems and their structures of power and dominance.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that question.
Thank you for the question, Fabiana. Dylan, I'm looking at our time. So what I'm gonna do is roll the two questions that are in the chat together, because I think it could work. And you push back on that if you disagree. I'm fine with it. Benji Brubaker is asking or stating that they'd love to hear you talk about the role the nonprofit industrial complex plays in promoting that white magic of reformism and limiting political imagination in movement work and universities, right? Because I think that universities, you made reference earlier to the academic industrial complex, and I think the MPIC and academic industrial complex are mirrored in a lot of ways. And then Cara Nelson's question is, what advice do you have for students looking to get involved in abolitionist work? So yeah, if you can, if it makes sense for you to answer both of those questions.
Yeah, so Cara, I'll point your attention to Cops Off Campus, and then I'll put the link up. Benji put up the critical resistance link right there too. And there's obviously there's obviously the abolitionist movement around Tulane University Police Department as well. So I think that's like a kind of blueprint answer I would give to folks who want to just get involved with shit, is like, there's probably, especially if you're at a university or college campus of some kind, there's probably something going on at your campus. And if not, probably something going on nearby. And if nothing's going on, then that's where you get something started, right? That's where you can take some responsibility and like start to try to convene people, which I think that's some of the best stuff, is when something's new and fresh and people are just getting it going. So that's what I would say to Cara, like, do that now. The other thing I'll say to other folks who might not be based at universities and colleges, there is a growing movement, and I would call it, an extension and actually a direct articulation of abolitionist movement, which is abolitionist, what folks call mutual aid, right? There's a kind of growing abolitionist movement that is encompassing mutual aid as a direct challenge to charity and philanthropy, and which is thinking about community and is actually creating these forms of community that are part of this diasporic, Black tradition I'm talking about, right? Like Eugene Memetics actually, Amika resists the term mutual aid. She refers to it as something like shared responsibility or deep responsibility, right? So like there's different terms we can use, but I know the common phrase that a lot of folks have started thinking through is mutual aid. And so my friend Dean Spade, who's a law professor in Seattle, he's probably one of the principal people that's really thought through this. And he has a great website called the Big Door Brigade, which I'll post up there in the links in a second if somebody else doesn't do it. So yeah, so like that's another way people can get involved. There's probably a mutual aid effort, organization, or something nearby where you are, regardless of where you are in this continent, at this point, that you can hook up with. And there's something you can do to be part of that form of community. So that's what I'll say to Car's point, which I think is so important. As far as thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex in universities, I think that those regimes have only grown. They've only grown in sophistication. They've only grown in their capacity to try to discipline, harness, and constitute, which is to say, to undermine and toxify an abolitionist political imagination. I think you see a lot of it playing out in the I think unresolved questions and controversies around the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation right now, right? I think it's distressing seeing how that challenge to the foundation is being responded to. I mean, I keep coming back to the really, I think, principled questions that were raised by the BLM 10+, which were the grassroots, city-based, place-based organizations, chapters of BLM that more than a year ago broke away from the BLM Global Foundation because they had questions just about the finances. That's one of the worst logical outcomes of the nonprofit industrial complex, right, in this moment, right, is that, and part of the problem with it, beyond that particular set of contradictions and unresolved questions, is the way it gets translated by multiple publics, including corporate media and social media and elsewhere, right, where now the issues and questions around BLM Global Foundation become a kind of stand-in for the entire movement, right? Which in the entire movement is not reducible to those who refer to themselves as Black Lives Matter chapters, nor is it certainly reducible to a particular foundation, right? So to get at Benji's question, that's the problem that I think we need to really come at radically and consistently, is to disarticulate this tendency to reduce this reductionist tendency to conflate movements, insurgencies, things which might not have a nameable center, right, or might not be configured around a particular organization, to reduce them to some relationship to a set of kind of foundations or foundation funded efforts, right? We saw this in 2020, 2021 with the rise of 8 Can't Wait with Campaign Zero, like another prototype situation. I would argue probably much more dangerous, actually. It needs to be talked about much more than what's going on with Black Lives Matter Global Foundation, right? What Campaign Zero is doing, the way that they're running people for, I mean, it's basically an extension of the Democratic Party in the worst ways imaginable, in the way that they tried to seize and undermine a growing abolitionist movement around policing. It's happening all the time. They're sophisticated, they're well equipped, they've got a lot of money, they've got direct connections to liberal philanthropic foundations. That is what the counterinsurgency looks like right now, right? The counterinsurgency is much less about the Proud Boys and these far right-wing jerks. Like, it's much less about them. I'm not saying those folks aren't dangerous, because they are, but I think it's much more about the tentacles of the nonprofit industrial complex, the philanthropic apparatus that is kind of funding and seizing control of the political imagination of movements as well as their people. That's what counterinsurgency looks like in this moment. We have to name it like that.
Dylan, I didn't know if real quick I could also invite you to talk a little bit about almost like the function that universities play and the relationship of campus policing to that. Like, I know, for instance, here at Tulane, we have our School of Professional Advancement, both offers a Homeland Security Studies program, which actively trains and also hires faculty who are, part of DHS, FBI, ICE, all across the board, and trains and certifies ICE officers and other agents of the state. And at the same time are just now launching a new program to offer college degrees for folks that are incarcerated. And then also thinking about how our downtown campus is expanding, and along with the presence of police are sort of pushing out communities in that area. So thinking about also real estate and things like that. So yeah, just any insights on like, what are some of the areas that folks have been resisting around university contributions to the prison industrial complex? Yeah.
Well, there's a growing reparations movement that I think some of the folks here probably are somewhat familiar with. I mean, there's a prominent versions of it happen in some of the so-called Ivy League institutions like Harvard, et cetera. But that's a growing movement around the country. I think it's probably something that would be really germane at Tulane, and there probably is already something going on there around this. But I think the articulation and deepening and growth of university-based reparations movements, which is to say reparations that targets the university, right? That targets the university, that identify and also researches and exposes the university's long colonial and chattel ties to the institution of slavery, and for that matter, U.S. apartheid and everything else. So I think that's one of the principal sites I see coming up. I think we just, like, folks that are committed just need to make sure that reparations movement isn't turned into another kind of domesticated and pacified arm of like a reformist, magic again, right? Because there's some really beautifully disruptive possibility that can happen here. That's one thing. I'll say as well that in addition to the things you just identified, right? So like, yes, universities, they train fascists, they train military folks, they train police officers, like on the ground, police officers, and they do that all the time. I think part of it is emboldening students. I mean, I don't know how strong it is there, but there's kind of pockets of this throughout different university and college communities of students, and oftentimes high school students, who actually oppose the presence of those programs, those training programs in particular on the campuses, and will actually like come and protest them, right? And for that matter, the recruitments that different Homeland Security, what used to be INS Border Patrol, they would come to campuses, folks would protest. Here at Riverside, probably 12 years ago, group of students came to a recruitment event that had the FBI, the CIA, and Homeland Security, right? They sent all women, queer, of color recruiters, right? Because they know what kind of campus Riverside is, right? So they did their homework and they didn't send any white people, right? And they sent, I think, 2 dudes, 2 women. I think one person was outwardly queer, right? Students had no patience for them and ran them off the campus. Came to the recruiting event, asked them, and they did it in the most clever, unapologetic, militant ways by asking. They were asking some. I remember one of my students, asked an officer who, to an untrained eye could have been an extended family member, right? Like they were like from the same general geography of this planet, right? And she looked at her, she said, how does it feel to be part of an apparatus that destroys families and disrupts, I mean, that's how she went at it, right? She's like, I had a question for you. She did that. And like, they just looked down, they left. They drove them off the campus, right? So like, this happens all the time everywhere, right? So I think that this goes down to, however, what I'll also add is this, we cannot let academics off the hook. Right, the academic arm of the university, meaning the research, archival, epistemological, curricular arm of the university, like that is as principal to the colonial and chattel regime in its long civilizational sustained damage and violence as the direct officer training has been. So academics have blood on their hands, and we need to name that. Right, we need to name that, and like scholars of all kinds need to name that, including ones who are not necessarily housed at universities. And part of that complicity as well is I don't want to exclusively direct it at like my colleagues, my faculty colleagues. I want to direct it at university administrators. Right, university administrators are the worst. Right, they are the worst, with very, very, very rare exceptions. Right, you'll have to prove to me that you're an exception. Okay. I was chair of our Senate for 2 terms. Like, I know how bad these people are, right? Even if they used to be good people at one time, they're not good people anymore, just by function, right? Like by function, it's often by spirit, like it's just bad shit going on. And here's how nasty they are, is like they will take terms like sustainability. I was just at a Senate meeting a couple of months ago where an administrator took the term sustainability, talk about university efforts towards sustainability, and he used the word sustainability to describe, Benji, what you were just talking about, which is university expansion, gentrification, criminalizing and bringing police presence down on unhoused people, getting rid of what little is left of affordable housing in the area. And they were calling it sustainability, right? So part of this, violence, institutional violence as well, is how administrators will take these terms, no different than what we were talking about earlier with police reform. They'll take these terms like sustainability and use that as cover for what we used to call gentrification. Right, I think we still call it that, but you know what I mean, right? Like they used to call it gentrification unapologetically, right? Until like some of our folks were able to kind of seize that term and expose it for what it is. But now they actually will use terms like sustainability to talk about that. So I think it's all present. I think that it's the totality of the university apparatus. That's the only thing I would add to what you just described. Is the totality of the university apparatus, especially research universities like Tulane and University of California and others.
Dylan, we are 2 minutes over our time.
Okay.
Thank you so much of that. My goodness, I am so thankful for your availability and your willingness to share with us on this day at this time. I'm looking forward to engaging into some collective rigorous study with you in the future. We've been connected now, so we're connected for life. So I can't thank you enough for very fulfilling and inspiring and enlightening dialogue today. And thank you to all of the participants as well for your really compelling questions to add richness to an already pretty rich dialogue.
Hey, I wish that we could do this in person, and I hope we able to do that one day soon. And I put my contact info and whatnot in the chat for a reason. Like, don't hesitate. I'm here for you. At this point, I'm so deeply cynical about so many things that I'm looking for community with folks wherever it can be found. So yeah, if there's some way that I could play a role in what you're doing to just move things along, like just call on me. Please just call on me. I'm really happy we were able to steal some space at Tulane today to make this happen. I really appreciate y'all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all.
Hi,